In February 1959, a group of hikers died in mysterious circumstances on the slopes of a then unnamed mountain. Now, one of the most famous mysteries of the 21st century. Are we any closer to understanding exactly what caused the Dyatlov Pass incident? The sun was beginning to set over the western rise as the two men crested the hill. A combination of exhaustion and the biting cold of the late Russian winter that slowed their progress to a crawl. But it had not dampened their determination. They plodded on through the deep snow with only one thing on their minds. They were students of the Ural Polytechnical Institute, and they were out searching for their friends who'd failed to return from a hiking trip 2 weeks prior. The dying light meant that they would soon have to call it today. They did not relish the prospect of finding their way back to camp in the dark, especially through such unforgiving terrain. But despite those dangers, they could not help but appreciate the allure of this wilderness had a calming, almost serene beauty, and they could only hope that it had been kind to their friends. Although their hearts remained resolute, after so many days searching, that hope was fading as quickly as the setting sun. Ahead of them, with the rising slopes of Kalaxia, translated from the Mansi word meaning dead mountain, so named by the local Mansi tribes, due to the fact that nothing ever grows there for this reason. The vision that greeted the two men in that late afternoon was an immense, perfectly smooth hillock, blanketed with pure white snow. And they would have turned back at that point, if not for the fact that something had caught their attention. In the midst of all that brilliant white, they could make out a singular, dark spot about halfway up the side of the mountain, sticking out like a sore thumb, completely at odds with its surroundings. It would take them another half an hour to reach, but as they got closer, they could make out the vague outline of a large tent. They knew immediately that it belonged to their missing friends, and upon inspection, they found that besides a large hole in the side canvas, everything else was in order. The sides of the tent had been insulated with coats and empty backpacks. Ski boots were lined up neatly near the entrance. Padded coats and blankets lined the floor, and elsewhere they found personal items stowed away, and a wood axe and saw. At the far end of the roughly 8 square meter shelter, the two rescuers breathed a sigh of relief as they noticed that there were no bodies. They cautiously celebrated as they permitted themselves to believe that their comrades were not dead, but they could not shake the feeling that something about the scene before them still seemed a little odd. They did not know it at the time, but this was only the beginning of an enduring mystery, one which remains unresolved to this day, a mystery that would go on to become one of the most famous and strangest cases, not just in Russia, but in the history of the entire world. Over the next few days, they would begin finding the bodies of their friends, but nothing about their death seemed to add up. There would be no satisfactory conclusion, and all investigation would quickly cease, not to be talked of again for quite some time. In the 1990s, after being buried in top-secret archives for more than 30 years, the Russian government finally released the details of the incident to the general public. It was not largely known about outside of Russia, but it would gain international attention throughout the late 90s, thanks to creepypasta websites and, of course, YouTube. This is a story you may have no doubt heard countless times already, but allow us to tell it one last time. We will present only the facts, and try to cut out any embellishment. We will run through the timeline of events and the precise details of the incident itself. We will address every theory in turn and pick them apart one by one. And by a process of elimination, we will try to deliver a clearer picture. But the fact of the matter is that we may never know exactly what happened on that freezing cold night back in February of 1959. What we do know is that a month before, in January of that year, 9 students of the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlovsk and an older ex-military companion set out to hike across the Siberian wilderness. There were 10 group members in total, and they were all experienced hikers, each being rated at grade 2 in their capability by the institute itself. Their aim was to reach Otterton Mountain in the northern New Urals, a trek which would take them over nearly 300 miles of terrain in the midst of a harsh Russian winter. They were led by Eagles Dyatlov, an accomplished radio engineer and a natural-born leader, respected by many of his peers. Everyone aspired to take part in one of his hikes, and it was considered a high honor to do so. It was after him that the mountain pass, where the incident occurred, would later be renamed. Making such a difficult journey would ultimately garner a grade 3 certification in hiking for all participants, the most prestigious hiking qualification in the country at that time, an achievement which required all members to cover at least 186 miles of ground, a third of which had to be in challenging terrain. The minimum duration of the trip had to be 16 days, with no fewer than 8 of those days spent in uninhabited regions and with at least 6 nights spent in a tent. It was a tough assignment, but in completing this task, the certification would allow each member to teach their craft as a master of sports, a distinction that everyone in the team was desperate to attain. And so a mixture of excitement and determination was in the air as the 10 companions stood on the platform at Sverdlovsk train station, stooped under the weight of their packs. Not once did the thought ever cross their minds that this would be their last trip, one that would ultimately end in disaster. 9 of the 10 members would never return alive. As fate would have it, the 10th member, Yuri, would cut his trip short halfway through the hike due to ill health, and it is thanks to him that we have a detailed account of the group's movements up until January 28. Everything after that point has been pieced together from journal entries and photographs taken by the group. Their arduous journey would play out as follows. On the evening of January 23rd, they caught the 9:05 p.m. train from which would take them over 200 miles north to The journey was roughly 11 hours in length and would see them arriving at their destination at 7 a.m. the next morning. Whilst in they caught up on some much-needed sleep and then spent the afternoon entertaining the children of a local school. In the evening, they boarded another train, which would take them 100 miles further north to Iverdol, arriving there at around midnight. This left them with a 6-hour wait before they caught a bus at 6 a.m. out of his A on January 25th. The next day they traveled further north to an area known simply as Sector 41, and there they would spend the night. At 4 p.m. on the 27th, they traveled up the frozen Lobster River in the dead of night and would arrive at an abandoned geological site in the early hours of the next morning. It was at this point that Iri, ended by rheumatism and other ongoing illnesses, would turn back. After saying their farewells, the rest of the group continued traveling north towards their objective. Yudin would look over his shoulder one last time to see his friends skiing away in the opposite direction, his heart heavy with disappointment, oblivious to the quiet irony that his illnesses had just saved his life. This was the last time he ever saw his friends alive. It was on January 29th that the group's hiking adventure would commence proper. After having traveled mostly by road and rail, it was now time for the hard work to begin as they made the rest of their way towards Otterton Mountain on foot. They continued skiing north along the frozen Lobster River into the late evening before setting up camp for the night On the 30th, they would head west, following the Spear River, one of the Lobster's tributaries, all the way up to the base of an unnamed mountain, marked on maps simply as Height 1079. In the years that followed, this peak would come to be officially recognized by its Mansi name of Kalatsiakal, the Dead Mountain. It was here that they would set up camp and build a cache to store any excess supplies, in an effort to lighten their loads. This was in preparation for the ascent of Odderton. February 1st would see progress slow to a crawl, as the harsh weather began to set in. The low visibility would contribute to the group straying off course, and in the last hours of daylight, they would find themselves halfway up the slopes of Height 1079. Eagle made the decision to set up camp here, for the night perhaps, due to a combination of not wanting to lose the ground they had already covered, and the fact that the daylight was fading fast. He also, more than likely, wanted to practice camping on a mountain slope, as an extra challenge for himself and the group. In any case, it is known that the hikers were settled into their tent by around 5:30 p.m. They worked on a mock paper together, the Evening Gotorten, which was a humorous report of the group's activities over the last few days, and also served as a team-building exercise. Photographs had also been taken whilst they were making camp, and everyone seemed to be in good spirits. But whatever took place over the next few hours is highly mysterious and would go on to become what is now known as the Dyatlov Pass incident. Nobody knows for sure exactly what happened, but from collected evidence, authorities were able to ascertain. But at some point during the night of February 1st, something spooked the hikers so much that they would cut their way out of the tent and run out into the freezing, cold night, barefooted and in little more than their underwear. All 9 group members perished, most of them from hypothermia, but some from horrific injuries, of which nobody has ever been able to satisfactorily explain. The entire event is still steeped in mystery, even after all this time, and although a few theories have come close to presenting a plausible explanation of exactly what took place, none of them are without their problems. The first sign of anything amiss came about midway through February. Igor and his companions had been due to return to Swerdlovsk on the 13th, but nothing had been seen or heard of them. This was no immediate cause for concern. Delays were normal, and at the start of the trip, Dyatlov himself had told Yuri Udin, the young man who had abandoned the hike early due to ill health, that he expected the return journey to take longer. By the 15th, families were beginning to feel a little concerned. They reasoned that at least a telegram or some other form of communication informing them of a delay should have been received by now. But they had heard nothing. 5 days later, on the 20th, with still no word, the group's families demanded that a rescue operation be mounted in order to locate their loved ones. The search parties were initially assembled of volunteers such as family members, fellow pupils and teachers from the university. On February 26th, a student by the name of Mikhail Sherevin and a close friend found the abandoned tent on the gentle 30-degree inclined slopes of Kalatsiakal. At an altitude of 800 meters, it had collapsed and appeared to be badly damaged. With a large slit in the side canvas, it had been covered with a light snowfall, and they found many of the group's belongings inside, but they could see nothing of the hikers themselves. The fading light meant that the search would have to be called off for the day. The rescuers made camp in a more optimistic mood than they had started out with. They firmly believed that the group were out there, somewhere alive, and braving the cold in a snow cave or abandoned house. They couldn't have known that the bodies of their friends were lying beneath the snow, lifeless and silent, not too far from their own camp. The next day, on February 27th, the full horror of the Dyatlov Pass incident would begin to unfold.